They arrived from across the sea, armed with faith, hunger, and the promise of empire. But hidden in their saddlebags were journals, raw, personal accounts of conquest, fear, and awe. These weren't just invaders. They were men with minds, doubts, and secrets. And their diaries would change how the New World was remembered forever. The Spanish conquest of the Americas wasn't just recorded by priests, monarchs, or future historians. It was documented in real time by the men wielding the swords. These were not professional writers. Many were barely literate. Yet within the torn pages of letters, diaries, and after-action reports, they left behind a raw and conflicted record. Sometimes boastful, sometimes fearful, always deeply human. For the conquistadors, writing was never neutral. It was dangerous, political, and personal. A man's words could secure his fame or end his career. It could win him land, titles, or forgiveness. Just as often, it could earn him the wrath of the crown or the church. Most of these men knew they were participating in something colossal: the destruction of empires, the rise of new ones. They were not simply killing or exploring, they were reshaping history. And many of them, whether out of vanity or desperation, felt the urge to explain themselves. Some wrote to justify their violence. Others sought to correct what they saw as lies in official reports. Still others, like Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, seemed to be struggling with their very souls, torn between Catholic duty and the brutal reality of conquest. But not all writing survived. Much was lost in jungle rot, shipwrecks, and fire. What we do have, often preserved in the archives of Spain or buried in forgotten libraries, reveals the psychological heartbeat of the conquest. A heartbeat is not always easy to hear. Consider this. Hernán Cortés, one of the most famous conquistadors of all time, wrote letters to Emperor Charles V, not just to inform, but to persuade. He described Aztec temples in gory detail, emphasizing their pagan rituals. He painted himself as both brave and righteous, a humble servant of God doing necessary, if regrettable, work. But these letters were crafted with intent. They were edited, revised. They were not diaries left on a nightstand. They were performances. Then there's Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a foot soldier who lived through it all and, decades later, decided to tell the true story. His memoir reads like an older man settling scores, with Cortés, with chroniclers, with time itself. He wanted credit, not just for fighting, but for remembering. In their pages, we see things no textbook can offer: the cold of the highlands before a siege, the fear of a jaguar scream in a dark forest, the hunger, betrayal, and strange beauty of a land that seemed to both curse and seduce them. These weren't just battle reports, they were confessions. And as much as they tell us about what happened, they also reveal how it felt to be there, to march through the unknown, to witness human sacrifice, to question whether you were a hero or the villain. This is not the story of conquistadors told about them. This is the story told by them, in their own words, with blood on their boots and ink on their fingers. Few figures from the conquest loom larger than Hernán Cortés. To some, he was a visionary commander. To others, a ruthless opportunist. But one thing is sure, Cortés was as skilled with a quill as he was with a blade. In a time when literacy was rare among soldiers, Cortés understood the power of narrative. He knew that gold could enrich a man's purse, but words could immortalize him. That's why, even as Tenochtitlan burned, he paused to write, not in confession, but in calculation. Between 1519 and 1526, Cortés wrote 5 long letters, the Cartas de Relación, addressed to Emperor Charles V. These weren't casual updates. They were meticulously crafted accounts of his campaign, written to justify his insubordination, glorify his actions, and persuade the Spanish crown that his conquest was both noble and necessary. In them, Cortés painted himself as the loyal servant of God and empire. He wrote of vast cities floating on lakes, temples thick with incense and blood, and native rulers who bowed at his feet. He described Moctezuma not as a man, but as a symbol of decadent paganism, a ruler who needed to be overthrown for the sake of Christian civilization. But behind the elegant phrasing and political flattery, there were silences, glaring omissions. Cortés rarely mentioned the backroom betrayals, the mass executions, or the calculated use of native allies. His letters were truth bent into shape, not lies, but strategically carved memory. And it worked. Back in Spain, the Cartas de Relación captivated readers. They made Cortés a celebrity, a hero of the New World. His language, filled with wonder and horror, fed the European imagination. Cities of gold, cannibalistic priests, feathered kings. It was a theater, and Cortés was both playwright and protagonist. But Cortés didn't write alone. One of his secret weapons was his secretary, Francisco de Gomara, a cleric and court intellectual who never set foot in the Americas, but would become Cortés's official chronicler. Decades later, Gomara would publish La Conquista de Mexico, a glowing history that turned Cortés into legend. It was widely read, quickly translated, and wildly inaccurate. Other conquistadors were enraged. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who fought alongside Cortés, was furious. Gomara's account, he said, erased the contributions of hundreds of soldiers and painted a sanitized picture of events. In response, Díaz wrote his True History of the Conquest of New Spain, a gritty, first-hand retelling that challenged Cortés's self-made myth. And yet, despite the contradictions, Cortés's version endured. Because in the age of empires, narrative was power, and few wielded it better. He knew when to exaggerate and when to feign humility. He admitted to faults, but only minor ones. He confessed fears, but never weakness. His letters were designed to keep him in the emperor's favor, especially after he had disobeyed orders by launching the Mexican expedition in the first place. His gamble was clear: conquest first, permission later. And to win forgiveness, he wrote. But Cortés wasn't just writing for Spain. He was also writing for history. He wanted to be remembered, not as a greedy rebel, but as a Christian knight in the jungles of the New World, someone who didn't just conquer, but converted. Not a destroyer of cultures, but a builder of civilization. Today, historians debate every line of the Cartas. How much was true? What was left out? How many details were dramatized for effect? And yet, even with all their biases, the letters remain among the most detailed and vivid accounts of early colonial Mexico. They provide insights no outsider could fabricate. Descriptions of Aztec society, architecture, customs, and military strategies that continue to inform scholarship today. But perhaps their most significant value isn't factual, it's psychological. Cortés's letters reveal a man trying to manage guilt and ambition, piety and pragmatism. A man torn between faith and greed, loyalty and self-interest. They show the mental gymnastics required to justify genocide as salvation, to see conquest not as theft, but as divine destiny. That's what makes his writing so compelling and so dangerous, because when violence is wrapped in noble words, it becomes easier to stomach, easier to repeat. And Cortés, knowingly or not, gave future conquerors a blueprint. Write the history yourself. Be the hero of your own story and send it directly to the throne. If Hernán Cortés was the empire's golden mouthpiece, Bernal Díaz del Castillo was its battered conscience. By the time Díaz sat down to write his memoirs, he was an older man, scarred, limping, and largely forgotten by the crown he had once served. But his memory was sharp, and his frustration had festered for decades. What he wrote would challenge the very foundation of the Conquest's official story. Diaz had been there. At the shores of Cozumel, the massacre at Cholula, the first glimpse of Tenochtitlan rising from the lake like a mirage. He had fought, bled, and buried his friends in the mud of Mexico. And now he watched as polished court historians like Francisco de Gomara, who had never set foot in the Americas, rewrote the story, turning Cortés into a solitary genius. This lone visionary brought down an empire by sheer will. To Diaz, this was not just dishonest, it was theft. It erased the hundreds of men who endured hunger, disease, mutiny, and death beside Cortés. It made legends out of lies. And so, Diaz picked up his pen. His work, The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, is one of the most extraordinary eyewitness accounts in world history. Not because it's perfect. Diaz's memory occasionally slips, and his biases run deep, but because it's raw, human, and defiant. Where Cortés wrote for emperors, Diaz wrote for ghosts, the men who never returned, and the truth he believed they deserved. From the opening pages, Diaz sets the tone. We went there to serve God and His Majesty, and also to get rich. It's an admission no royal scribe would dare put to parchment. But Diaz wasn't trying to win favors. He was trying to set the record straight. He recalled the stench of rotting corpses in the streets of Tenochtitlan, the trembling hands of men drawing lots before battle, the betrayal of native allies, the screams in the temples, the unbearable thirst during sieges when conquistadors drank the blood of their own horses was a common experience. He remembered Cortés not as a flawless hero, but as a brilliant, manipulative man, capable of both mercy and monstrous calculation. Diaz also gave credit where Cortés had not. He named the men who scaled the causeways. He praised the Tlaxcalans who fought beside the Spaniards. He even acknowledged the bravery of the Aztecs, admiring their resolve and ingenuity in war. But more than anything, Diaz gave voice to the rank and file, the nameless conquistadors whom history had rendered invisible, the men who patched their wounds with leaves, who whispered prayers before charging obsidian blades, who, in moments of victory, looked not like saviors, but survivors. And yet, for all his bitterness, Diaz's writing is filled with wonder. He marveled at the floating gardens of Xochimilco, the intricacy of Aztec marketplaces, and the libraries of indigenous scribes. He described Moctezuma's court with awe, noting the discipline, cleanliness, and ceremonial richness that rivaled any European palace. His tone swings from admiration to regret. He doesn't absolve himself, but he doesn't apologize either. Instead, he invites the reader into the contradiction, the sense of standing at the edge of two worlds, watching one rise as the other falls. The True History wasn't published until after Diaz's death. In his lifetime, it was merely a manuscript, passed around, ignored, and nearly lost. But over time, it would become a foundational text, a vital counterpoint to the glorified narratives of conquest that flooded Europe. Today, historians don't read Diaz for objectivity. They read him for complexity, for the friction between pride and pain, righteousness and reflection, for the way he lets silence sit next to celebration. Because in the end, Diaz wasn't trying to be a historian. He was trying to be remembered. He feared obscurity more than death. He had risked everything in the conquest. And now, as the medals went to others, and the pensions dried up, and the empire moved on, he realized the only way to outlive the crown was to write. So he did. He wrote for the men buried in unmarked graves, for the mothers who never knew where their sons had fallen, for the soldiers who were never painted in oil or draped in velvet. This is dedicated. He wrote for history, not the official kind, but the kind you whisper around campfires, the kind that bleeds and aches and dares to remember what others forget. And in doing so, Bernal Díaz gave the Conquest something it didn't want, a memory it couldn't entirely control. When empires fall, so do their voices. But in the ashes of the Aztec Empire, a chorus rose, quiet, fragmented, often overlooked, yet enduring. It came not from the victors, but from the conquered. And against all odds, the vanquished found a way to speak. In the years following the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spanish friars and officials scrambled to make sense of the land they had seized. They sought to catalog customs, religions, and histories. For this, they needed translators, informants, native scribes who had survived the siege, the plagues, and the spiritual upheaval that followed. These scribes became the bridge between two collapsing worlds. Among the most significant of these efforts was the Florentine Codex, compiled in the mid-1500s by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, a Spanish Franciscan missionary. But Sahagún wasn't working alone. His most excellent collaborators were a group of indigenous students and scribes educated at the College of Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco. Fluent in both Nahuatl and Spanish, they recorded oral histories, cultural practices, and even the conquest itself, not through Spanish eyes, but from the memories of the survivors. What emerged was a 12-volume masterpiece, a vast illustrated encyclopedia of Aztec civilization, written in Nahuatl and translated into Spanish. It was anthropology before the term existed, but buried deep within its thousands of pages was something even more rare, the voice of the conquered telling their own story. In Book 12 of the Codex, the Conquest is described with raw emotion and poetic clarity. The arrival of the Spaniards is not greeted with celebration, but with dread. Moctezuma is portrayed as a cautious, conflicted leader, paralyzed by omens and torn between hospitality and defense. The Spaniards are referred to as gods in early encounters, but this reverence quickly fades into horror. Eyewitnesses speak of the massacre at the Great Temple, of soldiers with iron weapons, of thundersticks that shattered stone, of horses, strange beasts that seemed part man, part god. They recount how temples were defiled, priests slaughtered, and idols burned. And they describe the starvation, the disease, the despair that followed, as much a conquest of spirit as of soil. But this was not mere mourning. The indigenous chroniclers also preserved defiance. They recorded how warriors resisted to the last, how women defended their homes, how priests hid sacred texts in caves. Even in loss, they wrote with a sense of honor, a refusal to let memory die. Other indigenous accounts followed. One of the most poignant came from Domingo Chimalpahin, a Nahua noble and historian writing decades after the conquest. His annals, written in Nahuatl using the Latin alphabet, offer a glimpse into how indigenous elites tried to preserve their status and identity under Spanish rule. Chimalpahin chronicled not just the arrival of the Spanish, but the earthquakes, eclipses, and political intrigues that shaped the colonial world for native people. To read his work is to see colonialism not as a single event, but as a slow erosion, one that left deep scars and strange fusions. Perhaps most haunting are the painted codices, pictographic books created before and after the conquest. Though Spanish authorities destroyed many, a few survived. The Codex Mendoza, Codex Boturini, and Codex Azcatitlan. These works blend European and Aztec visual languages. Warriors drawn in Spanish armor next to traditional glyphs, Christian saints beside Aztec gods. They are chaotic, beautiful, and defiant. Visual screams frozen in ink and color. What makes these indigenous voices so powerful is their duality. They are not simply victims or rebels. They are translators, memory keepers, mourners, and survivors. They occupy the gray space between worlds, forced to live under foreign rule, but determined to preserve what remained of their own. For centuries, these documents were ignored or mistranslated by European historians. Some were dismissed as propaganda, others as curiosities. But today, they are being reread, reanalyzed, and revalued. Not as footnotes to Conquest, but as central testimonies. The Florentine Codex is now seen as one of the most important works of Mesoamerican literature. Nahuatl writings are being digitized, translated anew, and taught in classrooms. And the painted codices have become national treasures, windows into a civilization that refused to vanish. Because the Aztecs didn't disappear, their capital was razed, their gods outlawed, their temples buried. But their stories endured. They endured in whispered songs, in surviving texts, in murals hidden behind mission walls. And above all, they suffered because the people remembered. Today, when we speak of the Conquest, we no longer talk only through the words of Cortés or Díaz. We also hear the trembling voices of those who lost everything, and yet wrote. They wrote so the world would know that they were more than ruins and relics. They were poets. They were warriors. They were survivors. While soldiers marched and cities burned, another kind of battle unfolded. Not on the battlefield, but on parchment. Across the Atlantic, the Spanish crown, at the pinnacle of a sprawling empire, barely understood. From the jungles of the Yucatan to the heights of the Andes, distant voices cried out for recognition, for power, for justice. Through letters. These letters, known as Relaciones de Mérito, or Relations of Merit, were official documents sent by conquistadors, governors, and settlers to King Charles I, later Emperor Charles V, and his royal court. Their purpose? To justify actions, request rewards, and solidify claims. They were part testimony, part propaganda, and often brimming with self-aggrandizing detail. And in them, we find another window into the psyche of the men who shaped the New World. The most famous of these correspondences came from Hernán Cortés himself. Between 1519 and 1526, Cortés wrote a series of 5 letters, the Cartas de Relación, detailing his expedition to Mexico. These letters are literary, calculated, and persuasive. Cortés portrayed himself not as a rogue adventurer, but as a loyal subject of the crown, crowning Christianity and order in barbaric lands. He highlighted the wealth of the Aztec Empire, the grandeur of Tenochtitlan, and the inevitability of Spain's triumph. But Cortés was also careful to distance himself from the worst atrocities. He wrote of battles and conversions, not massacres and enslavement. He praised native allies like the Tlaxcalans, while omitting the ruthless efficiency with which he destroyed rival cities. His goal was clear: to be seen as a hero, a builder of empire, and above all, deserving of royal favor. And he wasn't alone. Other conquistadors followed suit. Pedro de Alvarado, known for his brutality in Guatemala, penned letters framing his campaigns as necessary pacifications. Francisco Pizarro, after toppling the Inca Empire, sent reports that glossed over the deceit and violence of Atahualpa's capture, focusing instead on gold, souls saved, and loyalty to the crown. The letter was a performance, a political act designed to mold the narrative from the frontier. But the pen wasn't reserved for the victors alone. Some of the most fascinating letters came from indigenous nobles, friars, and colonial officials who challenged or complicated the conquest's official narrative. Don Diego de San Anton Muñón Chimalpahin, the Nahua historian, wrote annals that recorded not just battles, but political turbulence, famines, and shifting alliances from an indigenous point of view, sometimes addressed indirectly to the king or officials, hoping their truth would be heard. Then there were the pleas from broken towns, where disease and exploitation had hollowed out entire communities. Spanish administrators described labor shortages, starvation, and rising discontent. Some begged for priests. Others demanded more soldiers. The tone ranged from deferential to desperate. And most strikingly, there were letters from Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar whose advocacy for native rights shook the empire's moral foundations. In 1542, his fiery A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies was addressed to Prince Philip. In it, Las Casas detailed, with unflinching horror, the massacres, enslavement, and abuse he had witnessed across the Americas. He called out the conquistadors by name. He condemned their greed, and he dared the crown to act. The result? The new laws of 1542, which attempted to curb the abuses of the encomienda system, were met with fury from settlers and were largely ignored or repealed in the colonies. Still, Las Casas's pen had reached the throne, and his voice echoed far beyond Spain. Collectively, these letters form a vast, contradictory archive, a tug-of-war between glory and guilt, ambition and regret. They reflect not just what happened, but what people wanted remembered, and what they wanted forgotten. Some letters were buried in archives, others were published and became part of imperial mythology, and a few, like those of Las Casas, became moral lightning rods, warnings for future generations. Today, they are studied not just for what they say, but how they say it. The language of conquest is often flowery, evasive, and legalistic. Writers cloaked brutality in religious duty, wrapped greed in loyalty, and hid failure behind noble intention. Yet between the lines, we glimpse fear, confusion, and doubt. Because an empire is never clean, it is written in contradiction, in blood and ink. And while the sword may win the land, it is the letter that tries to explain it, justify it, and preserve it. The Spanish crown, inundated with reports from across its vast territories, could never fully grasp the chaos on the ground. But through these letters, contradictory, desperate, triumphant, we hear the heartbeat of the colonial machine, and the paper trail it left behind is not just bureaucratic, it is deeply human. As the conquistadors claimed cities with steel and fire, another army crept behind them. An army of friars, draped in brown robes and armed with crucifixes. These men of the cloth came not to conquer land, but to conquer souls. They believed they were on a divine mission, to bring Christianity to the peoples of the New World. But their mission would clash with the empire's thirst for gold, and often with the very people they sought to save. The Catholic Church played a central role in the Spanish colonization of the Americas. From the very beginning, conversion was used as a justification for conquest. The Crown and the Pope had granted Spain the right to rule these lands in exchange for one sacred duty: the evangelization of indigenous populations. This moral mandate gave rise to vast networks of missions, churches, and religious schools throughout New Spain. Leading this effort were the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, orders of friars who believed in living among the native people, learning their languages, and teaching them the Christian faith. They built missions along the frontiers, created grammars and dictionaries for indigenous tongues like Nahuatl and Quechua, and introduced new forms of education, art, and social structure. To some friars, this was not just duty, it was salvation. One of the most renowned early missionaries was Fray Toribio de Benavente, better known as Motolinia. Arriving in New Spain in 1524, he immersed himself in Nahua culture and defended the native people from some of the harsher excesses of the encomienda system. He saw the suffering and mass deaths from disease and labor, but he remained committed to the belief that Christianity could offer spiritual rescue. But not all friars walked gently. In some regions, conversion was enforced with fire and chains. Indigenous shrines were smashed. Ancient codices were burned. Rituals and beliefs that had defined civilizations for centuries were branded demonic. To the missionaries, these were pagan practices that had to be erased. But to the people, it was cultural annihilation. And resistance came. sometimes in silence, sometimes in revolt. In many villages, outward conversion was a mask. Baptized names covered old gods. Crosses sat beside carved idols. Syncretism, the blending of belief systems, flourished. Indigenous people reimagined Catholic saints as ancestral spirits. The Virgin Mary was sometimes seen through the lens of pre-Columbian fertility goddesses. Churches were built on top of ancient temples, but the old gods never entirely left. The church itself was not monolithic. There were deep tensions between those who supported the colonists and those who condemned them. Few figures represent this divide more powerfully than Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas had once owned an encomienda himself, profiting from the very system he would later denounce. But witnessing the brutality of conquest, the forced marches, the mass killings, the starvation, transformed him. He joined the Dominican order, and for decades, he wrote scathing denunciations of Spanish abuses. In his 1542 work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, he described entire native communities being wiped out under the guise of conversion and civilization. To Las Casas, the gospel could not coexist with violence. True conversion, he argued, must be voluntary. His writings reached the Spanish court and helped inspire the new laws, a set of reforms aimed at protecting indigenous people from enslavement and abuse. But these laws were deeply unpopular in the colonies and were widely ignored. Still, Las Casas persisted. In debates and letters, he insisted that indigenous people were fully human, with complex societies, spiritual depth, and moral worth. His vision was radical and largely ignored in practice. Yet his words endured, becoming foundational in the later human rights tradition. Throughout the 16th century, missionaries continued to spread across the Americas, building not only churches, but also hospitals, schools, and agricultural projects. In some areas, they were the only buffer between the native people and the settlers. In others, they were part of the same machinery of control. The legacy is complex. To some, the friars were protectors and translators, men who preserved languages, recorded histories, and shielded communities from extinction. To others, they were instruments of cultural erasure, flattening diverse spiritual traditions under a single holy banner. What's undeniable is their impact. By 1600, millions of indigenous people had been baptized. Hundreds of churches dotted the landscape, and Christianity, once foreign, had become woven into the very fabric of native life. Not as a copy, but as a hybrid. A new spiritual world was forming, forged in fire, ink, and quiet defiance. The missionaries believed they were planting seeds of salvation, but they also uprooted centuries of belief and identity. They recorded, erased, and reimagined. They wrote about the souls they saved, but rarely about the ones lost along the way. In the diaries and letters they left behind, we glimpse their devotion, their blindness, and their humanity. And in the faith still practiced across Latin America today, we see the enduring echoes of their mission, a legacy of both reverence and rupture. In the earliest days of Spanish conquest, alliances with indigenous groups were crucial. Cortés would never have entered Tenochtitlan without the support of the Tlaxcalans, bitter enemies of the Aztecs. Pizarro leaned on native rivalries to overthrow the Inca. Throughout the Americas, conquistadors promised autonomy, status, and protection to those who helped them topple empires. But those alliances would not last. As the Spanish colonial system took root, power dynamics shifted dramatically. The once valuable native allies were now seen as subjects, not partners. Their territories were absorbed, their leaders sidelined or removed, and their communities folded into the growing imperial bureaucracy of New Spain. This transformation wasn't immediate. It unfolded over decades, often through subtle reorganizations and seemingly bureaucratic adjustments. One of the most significant tools in this shift was the reduction, a policy that reorganized dispersed indigenous populations into centralized European-style villages under Spanish administration. The stated goal was to civilize and evangelize. But in practice, it disrupted ancestral lands, broke up kinship networks, and allowed colonial authorities tighter control over native labor and tribute. The caciques, local indigenous leaders who had once ruled with autonomy, were now required to collect taxes, enforce Spanish orders, and serve as intermediaries between their people and colonial officials. Some adapted, embracing their new role as colonial administrators. Others resisted or were replaced by more compliant figures, often appointed by Spanish governors regardless of legitimacy or lineage. The Spanish crown recognized the utility of these native elites, but only as long as they remained useful. In time, even they would be stripped of land, dignity, and authority. Meanwhile, indigenous political systems were eroded. The Aztec Altepetl, the Inca Ailu, and the Maya Batab system were all gradually dismantled and replaced by town councils modeled on Spanish governance. Native forms of justice, diplomacy, and consensus building gave way to written legal codes, distant bureaucracies, and colonial courts where few indigenous voices were truly heard. Some communities attempted to use the system to their advantage. They filed legal petitions, cited royal laws, and sent emissaries to Mexico City and even Madrid. A few indigenous leaders became adept at navigating the Spanish legal system, arguing for land rights or exemption from tribute. These acts of resistance were not loud rebellions, but quiet battles for survival fought with quills and paper. But the structural imbalance was undeniable. The Spanish had steel, horses, guns, and now they had the law, the church, and the crown behind them. What began as a military conquest had become a total restructuring of indigenous society. Yet the power shifts were not one way. In remote regions, highland villages, dense jungles, coastal outposts, many native communities retained significant autonomy well into the 17th century. They adapted Christian imagery into their rituals, used Spanish names while preserving oral histories, and obeyed colonial laws in public while maintaining sacred traditions in private. In some areas, native power persisted by becoming invisible. Community leaders performed loyalty, signed documents, and built churches. While underground, they preserved language, ritual, and memory. These were not the grand empires of the past, but resilient micro-worlds that refused to vanish. And sometimes, indigenous groups rose to assert their power more directly. In the decades after conquest, dozens of localized rebellions erupted across the Americas, often in response to overwork, religious suppression, land theft, or the abuses of encomenderos. Though few were successful in the long term, they revealed that submission was never total. The transformation from ally to subject was not just political, it was psychological. Many native communities had initially seen the Spanish as potential partners, or at least as new rulers in a long tradition of shifting powers. But as generations passed and the promises of partnership faded, resentment grew. Children were born who knew no life before the Spanish. The old gods were whispered about, but the churches were full. The tribute piles grew higher, and the land shrank. The colonial order was no longer a disruption. It was the new normal. Still, under that surface, indigenous identities endured. Stories were passed down. Rituals evolved. Languages survived, often in defiance of Spanish attempts to suppress them. And the memory of the alliances and the betrayals was not forgotten. By 1600, the indigenous world had been fundamentally altered. The political landscapes of Mesoamerica, the Andes, and the Caribbean were reshaped beyond recognition. Towns now governed once powerful kingdoms. Sacred centers had become missionary hubs. But the people remained. And in the tension between obedience and resistance, adaptation and endurance, a new kind of indigenous power was forming. not one rooted in empire, but in survival. The Spanish had won the War of Conquest, but the battle for identity was only beginning. They arrived unseen. No swords, no flags, no ships, no horses, just breathe, skin, blood. The greatest killer of the Age of Conquest was not steel or gunpowder. It was disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and others traveled faster than conquistadors, decimating populations before the first cross was planted or cannon fired. When Columbus first landed in 1492, the Americas were home to an estimated 50 to 100 million people, thriving in diverse civilizations, from the massive cities of the Aztec and Inca empires to the dense forests of the Taino and the intricate societies of the Mississippian mound builders. Within a century, up to 90% of that population would be gone. This demographic collapse is one of the greatest human catastrophes in recorded history. And yet, it left few visible ruins. It didn't always look like a conquest. Often, it looked like silence. Abandoned villages, empty fields, ashes of funerals that never stopped burning. The first wave came with Columbus's second voyage. Smallpox and influenza spread through the Caribbean like wildfire, devastating the Taino. By 1518, as Cortés marched into Mexico, the virus was moving with him. In 1520, just as the Aztecs regrouped after La Noche Triste, smallpox broke out in Tenochtitlan, killing tens of thousands, including Emperor Cuitlahuac. Cortés did not win Tenochtitlan alone. Disease softened the city, weakening its defenses, erasing its leadership, demoralizing its people. The Spanish described it as divine providence, but in truth, it was an unintentional weapon, a biological tsunami unleashed by contact. The patterns repeated across the continent. In Peru, Francisco Pizarro found an empire already destabilized by an epidemic that had taken the lives of Inca Emperor Huayna Capac and his heir. The result was a civil war, one that made Spanish conquest not only possible, but almost inevitable. Native populations had no immunity to Old World pathogens. Generations of exposure in Europe had created a fragile balance. Most people survived childhood illnesses, or at least knew how to treat them. But in the Americas, diseases arrived with no context, no explanation, and no cure. To the indigenous mind, the plagues were often interpreted as divine punishment, sometimes for welcoming the Spanish, sometimes for resisting. Some turned to Spanish gods. Others turned more fiercely to their own. But prayers did not stop the dying. By the mid-1500s, the scale of death was incomprehensible. In central Mexico alone, the population fell from 25 million to just 1 million in less than a century. In some regions, entire cultures vanished without a battle. There were no mass graves, just bones in the earth, and names erased from memory. The impact of this collapse was not only biological, it was societal. Labor systems built on native tribute collapsed. Spanish colonists scrambled to replace their dying workforce, turning increasingly to African slavery. Entire regions had to be repopulated by force, migration, or importation. Colonial towns were built on top of ghost villages, their foundations laid over forgotten ancestors. Some Spanish priests, like Bartolomé de las Casas, began to document the horrors, not just of war, but of disease. They spoke of empty churches, silent markets, and roads lined with bodies. Las Casas described the Caribbean as a place where once walked multitudes, now heard only the wind. In an effort to explain or justify the devastation, colonial thinkers turned to theology. Many believed the plagues were God's way of clearing the land for Christian rule. Some even saw disease as evidence of indigenous inferiority, proof that they were not meant to survive. This mindset would poison centuries of colonial ideology. The belief that the New World was an empty canvas, a land without history or rightful heirs. But the silence of disease was not total. Some native communities endured. They buried their dead and kept walking. They rebuilt towns, changed farming methods, and adapted rituals. The survivors became cultural stewards, holding on to language, memory, and resistance. New generations were born into a broken world, but they lived. Still, the demographic catastrophe shaped everything that followed. The power balance shifted, the colonial order solidified, and the Americas, once defined by their vibrant human diversity, became a world of echoes, a hollowed land where the dead outnumbered the living. Today, we often tell the story of conquest in terms of battles and politics. But the real turning point was microbial. It was invisible. It lived in the lungs of sailors, the skin of soldiers, the breath of priests. It needed no orders. It simply spread. And long after the flags were planted and the kings had claimed their glory, the plagues kept moving, reshaping a continent not through force, but through absence. When the swords were sheathed and the cities burned or baptized, Spain did something unexpected. It wrote laws. The conquest of the Americas was not only a military campaign, it was also a legal one. Spain did not merely want gold or souls, it wanted legitimacy. And legitimacy required rules. In the wake of conquest, Spanish officials began the long task of organizing their vast new possessions into a governable empire. The territories were renamed the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and colonial law became the scaffolding upon which Spanish rule would be built. Courtrooms, audits, councils, decrees. At the center of this legal machine stood the Council of the Indies, created in 1524. Operating out of Madrid, it acted as the supreme legislative, executive, and judicial body for all Spanish colonies. It reviewed reports, appointed officials, issued laws, and judged disputes, all from across the Atlantic. But these laws were not purely bureaucratic. They were part of a moral and religious project. Spain claimed it had a sacred duty to civilize, convert, and uplift the indigenous peoples. This mission, however, clashed constantly with economic greed and the reality of colonial violence. The contradictions came to a head in one of the most pivotal legal moments of the 16th century, the Laws of the Indies. The first attempts came in 1512 with the Laws of Burgos, aimed at regulating the behavior of settlers and protecting indigenous people from outright abuse. But enforcement was nearly impossible. Colonial governors often ignored the mandates, and settlers frequently resisted any restriction on their control. Then, in 1542, after years of mounting concern and advocacy by priests like Bartolomé de las Casas, the Spanish crown issued the new laws. These were more ambitious. They abolished the inheritance of the encomienda system, a brutal labor arrangement that granted colonists rights to indigenous labor. The backlash was immediate. In Peru, colonists rebelled. One of the Spanish viceroys enforcing the new laws was murdered by angry encomenderos. In Mexico, the laws were slowly rolled back, watered down, or delayed under colonial pressure. The message was clear. Even as Spain tried to legislate morality, the colonists prioritized profit. Still, the legal system evolved. Spain created an elaborate audiencia structure. Royal courts spread across its territories, staffed by magistrates sent from Spain to ensure oversight. Local town councils, cabildos, gave some administrative autonomy, but only to Spanish settlers. Indigenous people had their own councils, but these were subordinate and often symbolic. The law also codified racial hierarchies. As African slavery expanded and mestizo populations grew, colonial officials introduced the casta system, a complex taxonomy of race that assigned rights, taxes, and privileges based on blood. Spaniards born in Europe, peninsulares, were at the top of the social hierarchy. Creoles, Spanish born in the colonies, mestizos, indigenous peoples, Africans, and all mixed descendants were placed on a descending ladder. This wasn't just social, it was legal. Race became a legal identity. It affected inheritance, court testimony, tax obligations, and marriage permissions. In many ways, it was an early blueprint for modern systems of racial classification and structural inequality. For indigenous people, the law was both a tool of oppression and, paradoxically, a shield. The Spanish crown insisted that native populations were its subjects, not enslaved people. They had certain rights to land, to protection, to practice their culture, within reason, and to petition the king. This led to a remarkable, often overlooked phenomenon: indigenous lawsuits. Throughout the 1500s and beyond, native communities learned to use Spanish courts. They hired translators, produced land documents, cited royal decrees, and sued Spanish colonists for abuses or illegal land grabs. Some cases succeeded. Others dragged on for decades. But the very act of litigation became a form of resistance. Colonial law thus created a strange duality, a system designed to extract and dominate, but wrapped in the language of protection and divine mission. It gave the colonizers moral cover while also creating spaces for indigenous survival, and sometimes justice. In the countryside, however, the reality was often far from the courtroom. Remote areas were ruled more by local strongmen than by legal codes. Corruption was rampant. Royal inspectors, or visitadores, were sent to root out abuses, but they were often compromised or outmatched. Even so, the existence of a legal framework, however flawed, gave shape to colonial life. It determined how cities were built, following the Law of the Indies grid model, how marriages were recorded, how trade was taxed, and how rebellion was punished. By the end of the 1500s, New Spain had become a fully formed colonial state, not just a military occupation, but a legal and cultural ecosystem. Churches stood beside courtrooms. Enslaved people toiled under official contracts. Indigenous languages were translated into legal petitions. It was a world governed by both the cross and the quill, and beneath the surface, by the quiet calculations of power. Centuries have passed since the conquistadors sailed west, crossed mountains, and toppled empires. But the ink they left behind, in letters, logs, and diaries, has outlived their gold, their palaces, and in many cases, their own names. These first-hand writings are more than chronicles of conquest. They are windows into a world in transition, a world where brutality and belief walked hand in hand, where men spoke of glory while documenting genocide, and where religion was both salvation and justification for subjugation. The diaries of conquistadors like Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who fought with Cortés, or Pedro Cieza de León, who chronicled the Andes, are not just war stories. They are complex, often contradictory accounts. These men described indigenous civilizations with awe, noting their cities, rituals, and societies, even as they laid them to ruin. In these texts, we find both admiration and arrogance. Conquistadors were stunned by the engineering of Tenochtitlan, the order of Inca roads, and the scale of indigenous markets. Yet they saw it all through a prism of European supremacy, convinced that they were agents of civilization rather than invaders. But memory is a strange thing. For centuries, these accounts were taken at face value, used in Europe to glorify the conquest, to paint indigenous peoples as either savages or passive victims. Spanish schoolbooks extolled the bravery of Cortés and Pizarro. Cathedrals were named after them. Statues were erected in their honor. Yet the same writings that justified conquest also revealed its horrors. Díaz described mass killings, extorted gold, and temples turned to ash. Bartolomé de las Casas, though not a conquistador, compiled testimony from survivors and monks, a chilling ledger of cruelty. He called it the destruction of the Indies. In time, These documents fueled a backlash. They were used by Spain's rivals, England, the Netherlands, to build the Black Legend, a portrayal of Spain as uniquely cruel and bloodthirsty. While exaggerated, it planted seeds of doubt in the myth of noble conquest. More importantly, the writings have been reclaimed by indigenous scholars, historians, and artists. Today, the same diaries that once celebrated empire are studied to understand what was lost and what survived. Indigenous voices, once silenced, are now being reinserted into the story, often through the margins and footnotes of the very texts that erased them. In Mexico and Peru, descendants of the conquered have begun to reinterpret the conquest, not as a one-time event, but as a centuries-long process of resistance, survival, and cultural adaptation. Oral traditions are being recorded. Indigenous languages are being taught again. The documents of the past are being decoded through new eyes. Museums now display conquistador artifacts beside indigenous relics, not to glorify one or the other, but to juxtapose them, to force questions. What does it mean to hold a sword that once cut through a civilization? Or to read the words of a man who described killing with the righteousness of faith? And what about the men themselves? Cortés died a wealthy exile, scorned by his own empire. Pizarro was murdered by fellow Spaniards, betrayed by his own ambition. Their empires collapsed in civil war, corruption, and rebellion. The gold they looted funded palaces in Spain, but the spiritual cost of their conquest would echo for generations. Yet their diaries remain. Unearthed in archives, translated in classrooms, quoted in debates. Why do we still read them? Because in their pages lie not just the strategies of conquest, but the psychology of empire. The justifications, the fears, the obsessions. Their words are mirrors, showing us how men justify horror, how faith can blind, how memory is shaped not by truth, but by the stories we choose to tell. The conquistadors are long dead, their bones lost to time, but their diaries whisper still, in classrooms, in museums, in prayers whispered at ruined temples. And perhaps that is the final irony of empire, that what endures is not always what was built, but what was written.